Wild, robust, a frontier finally tamed, at last reachable by land and sea. An America populated in part by cast-offs from a host of teetering kingdoms, striving to make an everyday reality of e pluribus unum. From the many, one. The movies provided that unifying experience. They all went to the movies to thrill to America's storybook heroes, their six guns blazing in the cause of justice. Then, when newsreels made their flickering debut in the early 1900s, together Americans of different clans and colors could grasp their country's growing importance in the world of nations. For 56 years, until 1967, newsreels were seen weekly by 40 million people throughout the United States. In World War II, newsreels reached their finest hour. They saw the American way of life at stake. Now they stood united behind real-life heroes, their own American sons fighting in the cause of freedom. They gave patriots back home a chance to catch glimpses of loved ones overseas and brought the battlefront to the home front. For this collection of edited newsreel footage covering the war years, we salute the courageous cameramen of World War II who gave their talents and sometimes their lives. A significant share of America's victory goes to them.
At the conclusion of World War I, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 was bitterly resented by defeated Germany, particularly among extreme nationalists like the rising Nazis. In 1932, the city of Munich staged its yearly memorial service for Germany's dead in World War I. 10 years earlier, 3 years after the Versailles Treaty, this Nazi rally led to Hitler's first unsuccessful attempt to seize power. At this time, however, the German government still opposed the Nazis. In 1932, Army Field Marshal von Hindenburg, revered hero of World War I, defeated Hitler for the presidency. He referred to Hitler as that damned corporal. But still, Hitler was gaining popularity by pledging, among other things, to avenge Germany's defeat in World War I. On January 30th, 1933, President von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. That night, Nazi sympathizers gathered to cheer their idol outside the Chancellery in Berlin. Von Hindenburg had talked of the unpleasant duty of appointing that damn corporal. As for the Nazis, they knew they finally had a foot in the door. Hitler and his cabinet posed for the cameras. Goering was one of only 2 Nazis in the cabinet. But for Hitler, this was just the beginning. Starting on January 30th, 1933, he would tighten his grip on Germany with relentless precision. Soon, all of Germany would echo to the frightening sound of Sieg Heil. The Versailles Treaty settled the fate of defeated Germany after World War I. President Wilson saw it as a series of unsatisfactory compromises. But to Adolf Hitler, it was an abomination. And as Chancellor of Germany, he set about to tear it down. On March 7th, 1936, he sent German troops into the Rhineland on the border with France, which, according to the Versailles Treaty, was supposed to remain demilitarized. It was a bold gamble. The German army at that time was hardly in a position to challenge the might of neighboring France. Hitler later said that if France had moved just 3 infantry battalions against him, he would have had to withdraw. Even worse,
Allied statesmen, by their lack of nerve, convinced Hitler that he could get away with anything. French Foreign Minister Flandin and British Foreign Secretary Eden were spokesmen of timid governments which failed to understand that in 1936, Hitler could still have been stopped. After the Rhineland, Hitler's prestige among the German people rose to new heights. In 1937, Mussolini went to Germany with a lingering disdain for Adolf Hitler. Having long considered him a mere imitator, he had even refused Hitler's request for an autograph picture. Hitler, on the other hand, had always admired Il Duce as a reckless gambler with a flamboyant style. In 1937, he set out to impress him with a spectacle of German military might and precision. By all accounts, Mussolini was impressed. Hitler skillfully created the illusion that Italy would share as an equal partner in the military victories to come. Easily dazzled by mass spectacles and adulation, Mussolini left very pleased, extending an invitation for Hitler to be his guest in Italy the following year. The Axis alliance was in the making. Il Duce would soon declare, "I have a friend, and I will march with him to the end." On July 7th, 1937, the first shots were fired in Japan's all-out attack on China. Japanese planes inflicted on the Chinese untold horror and devastation. To indict Japan for these outrages, China had the eloquent voice of its own leader's wife, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She spoke out on October 15th, 1937.
You have seen in the pictures, and you have read of the destruction of homes and the terrible slaughters being carried out by the Japanese throughout our country, wherever their bombers could fly. This is in violation of all treaties and human rights.
The U.S. gunboat Panay, her colors clearly visible from the air, was attacked by Japanese planes on December 12, 1937. The day before, the Panay had evacuated American civilians, including journalists and cameramen, from the Chinese city of Nanking, which was about to fall to the Japanese. And so, cameras were on hand to record one of the most dramatic incidents of the 1930s, the futile resistance of the Panay, the evacuation of her passengers, the death of 2 crewmen and 1 civilian, and the final sinking of the Panay in the muddy waters of the Yangtze River. U.S. naval intelligence revealed that the attack had been deliberately planned, but Japan apologized profusely, said it had been a mistake. America accepted the apology. The survivors and the dead were taken aboard the USS Augusta. In 1937, the sinking of 1 gunboat and the loss of 3 lives did not lead to war. That would come 4 years later, with the sinking of practically the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Chancellor Schuschnigg told the people of Austria, "We have yielded to force. We have instructed our army not to resist." Obliging customs officials removed border gates as the German army crossed into Austria on Saturday, March 12, 1938. Hitler liked to start invasions on weekends. It was a way, he said, of catching other nations napping. He himself planned the operation, despite the nervousness of his generals, who claimed the German army was not ready. But the surprise element worked for Hitler, and Austrian Nazis had laid the groundwork. His entry into Vienna could only be described as a triumph. Hitler had been born an Austrian. "For me," he said, "this is the proudest hour of my life. Germany has now become Greater Germany." Within 6 months, he would lay claim to parts of Czechoslovakia. The following year, he would attack Poland and start World War II. Claiming that Czechoslovakia's Sudeten Germans were being persecuted and making sure that their plight received maximum publicity, Adolf Hitler vowed in September 1938 that he would put an end to what he called this outrage. Ignoring those who believed Hitler should be stopped, on September 15, 1938, Britain's Prime Minister Chamberlain went to see Hitler to negotiate his demands. Force? Who speaks of force, said Hitler. And only moments later, I shall settle the question one way or another. But Chamberlain was for peace at any price. He returned from his first visit to Hitler still rather satisfied.
I trust that all concerned will continue their efforts to solve the Czechoslovak problem peacefully, because on that turns the peace of Europe in our time.
Chamberlain's policy was popular. The public feeling was, why go to war for Czechoslovakia? A week later, Chamberlain went to see Hitler a second time. Hitler's wanting Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, with its more than 2 million Germans, seemed reasonable enough to Britain's Prime Minister Chamberlain. So on September 30th, 1938, he signed the Munich Pact, especially since Hitler said this was positively the last frontier he would cross, and topped it with a special agreement requested by Chamberlain, who spoke of it with great pride upon his return to Britain.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
The Munich Pact meant the sellout of Czechoslovakia, and eventually Chamberlain became the villain of the peace. But in 1938, he was hailed standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace beside his king and queen as the savior of peace. In 1938, Czechoslovakia's President Eduard Beneš mobilized military forces to counter Nazi claims to the Sudetenland and its border fortifications. But with the Munich Pact, Hitler got Britain and France to agree to his demands. The Sudetenland went to Germany, and Poland also made off with a piece of Czechoslovakia, as did Hungary. Snapping his fingers, Hitler said, "We got everything we wanted, just like that." Hitler and Mussolini were triumphant. A few days later, on October 5th, 1938, President Beneš resigned. Czechoslovakia had been abandoned by her allies, Britain and France. What remained of Czechoslovakia was partitioned by Germany and Hungary 5 months later. It was the last act of the tragedy.
In 1939, Hitler was carefully planning his invasion of Poland. He feared Russian interference, so under the guise of friendship, he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets and agreed to give them half of the conquered Polish territory. In addition, the Germans promised the Russians military armaments in exchange for Russian oil and Russian wheat. Two years later, the Russian oil and wheat was used against them as the Germans turned on their Soviet allies and began their famous but ill-fated invasion of the Russian homeland.
Backed by an awesome military machine, Adolf Hitler was ready to strike at his neighbor to the east. Poland knew the attack was coming. Poland, with its 35 million people, was in Hitler's eyes an easy prey. Its outmoded army lost its only outstanding leader when Marshal Joseph Pilsudski died in 1935. It lived on past glories and concepts of warfare 20 years behind the times. Spearheaded by paratroop units, 3 German armies struck at dawn on September 1st, 1939. It was the first demonstration of what the Germans called blitzkrieg, an explosive thrust with powerful mechanized forces breaking through defensive lines in swift encircling movements. That victory in 1939 reinforced in Hitler the conviction that he was, in his own words, a political and military genius.
Wir teilen Deutschland in stolzer Freude seines Söhnes.
Only this time, on September 1st, 1939, his attack on one of Germany's neighbors met with resistance and would lead to a war which would eventually engulf the entire world. Committed to Poland's defense, on Sunday, September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France went to war against Germany. The Graf Spee, one of Germany's 3 so-called pocket battleships, roamed the South Atlantic and sank 9 British merchant vessels at the beginning of World War II. After warning shots were fired, boarding parties would seize the freighters and round up the crews for transfer to an auxiliary German prison ship called the Altmark. Some of the more accessible cargoes were also taken before the ships were sent to the bottom. The suddenness of the attack prevented most captive vessels from radioing for help. More than 300 British seamen captured by the Graf Spee would be freed in one of the war's most dramatic rescues only hours before reaching captivity in Germany. The Graf Spee's 3 months of sea raiding terror ended on December 17th, 1939, when, cornered off Montevideo, Uruguay, she blew herself up rather than be captured. The day before, the Germans had occupied strategic points along the Norwegian coast. So on April 10th, 1940, the 2nd British destroyer flotilla was ordered to Norway to attack whatever German naval forces it might encounter. It became known as the First and Second Battle of Narvik. In the first encounter, the British lost 2 destroyers against 2 of the enemy. The British came back 3 days later and, guns blazing, sailed up the same Norwegian fjord and this time sank 8 German destroyers and 1 submarine. Narvik gave Britain a much-needed naval victory in those dark early days of World War II. In the spring of 1940, French Premier Edouard Daladier felt certain that his heavily fortified Maginot Line would prove impregnable if Adolf Hitler decided to throw the weight of the German war machine against France. The interconnected fortresses and tunnels ran from the south of France to the forest of Ardennes in the north near the Belgian border. Early in May, the Nazis began playing martial music through loudspeakers facing the French fortifications. Then, when the Germans moved on May 11th, Hitler's plan became clear. He would outflank the Maginot Line by attacking France and her allies through Belgium and the forest of Ardennes. 300,000 Allied troops had to be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, and the Republic of France fell in 5 weeks. Late in May of 1940, the Nazi war machine pounded away at the retreating Allied army holed up at Dunkirk, France, waiting to escape across the English Channel. When the Royal Air Force arrived to provide cover, German anti-aircraft cut down their numbers with a deadly fire. This was early in World War II. France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland had surrendered within days of each other, and Hitler would have loved to wrap up the war in Europe with a British surrender. But then the German attack slacked off, and 250,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers were evacuated in a makeshift fleet. Some historians believe that Hitler permitted this escape to make negotiations easier if Britain decided to surrender.
This is William L. Shirer speaking from the forest of Compiègne, where Adolf Hitler today is handing his armistice terms to France.
The date was June 14th, 1940. The narrator is William L. Shirer, prominent journalist and radio correspondent.
I can see his face. It is grave, solemn, yet brimming with revenge. Off to one side is a large statue of Marshal Foch. Hitler does not appear to see it. Now we see the French walking down the avenue, led by General Hunsinger. Hitler and the other German leaders rise as the French enter. General Keitel reads the preamble to the German armistice terms. This whole ceremony is over in a quarter of an hour.
The Nazi occupation of Paris would bring 5 long, frustrating years of divisive agony to the French people.
Early September 1940, an act of Nazi fury was about to begin. The night bombing of London would be aimed at civilians, and the words of Winston Churchill would give thousands of Londoners a belief that their ordeal would somehow help to reach the final victory.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
80% of the homes were destroyed or damaged, and 30,000 Londoners died in 6 months of almost nightly bombings. Then the R.A.F. turned the air war around, and their finest hour took on immortal dimension. The voice of England's World War II Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
In July, August, and September 1940, 40 or 50 squadrons of British aircraft broke the teeth of the German air fleet at odds of 7 or 8 to 1.
That victory allowed the RAF to begin daylight bombing of Nazi bases in France and Germany. After the United States entered the war in Europe in 1941, round-the-clock bombings by British and American planes seriously crippled the German war machine and paved the way for the Normandy invasion. Later, Churchill made his famous tribute to the RAF.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Recent revelations that the British had broken the German military radio code in World War II have dramatized a dilemma of leadership. That the Germans planned to destroy Coventry in a saturation air raid became known to Prime Minister Churchill 4 hours before the attack on November 14, 1940. He could have evacuated the city and risked tipping off the Germans that their code was broken. To keep the secret as a potent weapon for ultimate victory, he decided not to evacuate. 172 died in the air raid. Against that fearful loss, Churchill had to weigh the final triumph that could be won by protecting the secret only he and a very few others knew.
In March 1941, England was standing alone against the Nazi war machine. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. Ambassador Winant signed an agreement that gave the United States the use of British air and naval bases in the Atlantic. In exchange, the U.S. gave Great Britain 50 destroyers. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's decision to aid England caused controversy. His policy was dangerously close to violating the neutrality laws. But when the president took his case to Congress, he received overwhelming support. Appropriately, the first destroyer sent to England was named His Majesty's ship Churchill. Despite the Nazi boast that none of the ships would reach England, they were soon on patrol fighting the German U-boats. and the United States was one step closer to entering the war.
We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers, ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
In the spirit of that pledge by President Roosevelt in 1941, in ever-increasing numbers, U.S. planes, tanks, trucks, guns, and ammunition started arriving in beleaguered Britain. The pilots who had been fighting the air war against Nazi Germany had high praise for the newly arrived aircraft.
If all the American aircraft we get are as good as my Flying Fortress, we shan't go far wrong. What about your Tomahawk? Well, I like my Tomahawk very much. She's got a good turn of speed, and the maneuverability is very good at both low and high altitudes.
Once again, Hitler's war machine was in motion. This time it was against Yugoslavia and Greece. The date was April 6, 1941, and the date was crucial. Hitler attacked in the Balkans to protect his southern flank 2.5 months before starting his great onslaught against the Soviet Union in the east. Although it was an easy conquest, he made, from his point of view, a fatal mistake. By mounting his attack against Yugoslavia and Greece, Adolf Hitler delayed by 2.5 months his attack on the Soviet Union. He had planned on conquering Moscow before the onset of winter. Historians now say that had he not committed 20 divisions and 2.5 months of military effort in the Balkans, he might indeed have conquered Moscow and subdued Russia. Yugoslavia may well have saved the Soviet Union in World War II, but it is one of those might-have-been questions of history and human life. He was Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, one of the original Nazis. In May 1941, he became the protagonist of a strange adventure. Without Hitler's knowledge, he secretly flew to England, hoping to get Churchill to negotiate peace with a victorious Germany. He was not hailed for his efforts. This Scottish farmer captured Hess when he landed by parachute at night. Hess started talking to him about his wife and child.
Yes, I'm the man that captured Rudolf Hess. I rushed out of the house, and the first thing I saw was a man in the parachute who came slowly down through the darkness. He said he was married and pulled out a photograph of his little boy, of whom he was very proud. He said, I have seen him this morning, but heaven knows when I shall see him again. This is my mother, of whom I am very proud, and who looked after the German prisoners when he was with us, and looked after his comfort, and looks after my comfort very well.
It was a pleasure to do anything for the Jerry, for after all, he was some mother's son.
Hess spent the war in a British prison, reappearing on the world scene at the Nuremberg war crimes trials of 1945. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he was to remain for years a lone, solitary inmate of Berlin's Spandau prison.
Germany, 1941. The launch of the battleship Bismarck, the pride of the German Navy. Adolf Hitler himself comes to see her off. The Bismarck sets sail for war. Her lifespan at sea is 1 week. On May 26, 1941, she is attacked by the British battleships Rodney and King George V. After 24 hours of continuous torpedo assaults, the unsinkable Bismarck goes down. Joseph Stalin ruled Russia for 3 decades, but held no state office until 1941, when he replaced Premier Molotov. He had eliminated all competitors and made subtle concessions to the masses. The wage differential between skilled and unskilled workers was allowed to increase. Farms had been collectivized, but some private farming was tolerated. Throughout the 1930s, he had also built a huge Red Army to reinforce his undercover dealings with Adolf Hitler. Stalin had been openly negotiating with the Allies when suddenly in 1939, he announced a treaty with Hitler and began carving up Poland, Finland, the Baltic republics, and Romania. In 1940, Molotov went to Berlin to enlarge on the treaty, but instead, Hitler suddenly attacked Russia and almost brought Stalin to his knees. Allied action in Africa and Europe and a severe Russian winter then stalled Hitler's armies and saved Stalin's Russia from a disastrous defeat.
It was July 1941. London was being battered from the air. The French had surrendered the year before. The question was not whether, but when Hitler's Germany would invade England. But Winston Churchill had vowed, "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And in that spirit, British soldiers rehearsed for the epic role assigned to them by Winston Churchill. They trained for fighting in the streets of London. As it happened, Hitler abandoned all his invasion plans once he got himself bogged down in the invasion of Russia in the east. For Britain, it all remained, fortunately, only a rehearsal. But Churchill's eloquence made history. The Atlantic, August 14th, 1941. A British warship carried Prime Minister Winston Churchill to a secret rendezvous with an American naval vessel off Newfoundland. Here, in a series of momentous shipboard conferences that continued for 4 days, the British leader met for the very first time with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Here, the 4 freedoms were reaffirmed, the Atlantic Charter proclaimed, and the United Nations born. And here, Anglo-American bonds grew stronger as the 2 leaders joined on a Sunday morning in a traditional church hymn.
In World War II, Leningrad withstood an epic 900-day siege by Hitler's forces. On September 6, 1941, the attack began. Within 14 days, all rail and communications were cut off. The Russian winter brought massive starvation to the beleaguered city. Thousands were dying every day. Lake Ladoga to the north, frozen over, gave them a chance. Supplies, beef, oil, wheat, and arms were transported across the ice. On January 18th, 1944, the great Russian counterattack began. The Germans entered Leningrad as prisoners, the last chapter in an epic tale of courage and suffering.
Half of Russia's top military leaders had been executed on Stalin's orders in the 1937-38 purges. Now, in October 1941, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. The Russian army had suffered disastrous losses when Hitler attacked in June 1941. Now, in October, the Russians were finally able to launch a counterattack. Stunned by the initial setbacks, Marshal Stalin had not spoken publicly for weeks. Then he called on the people to fight for Mother Russia. His appeal to their traditional patriotism worked miracles. The German drive was halted. The Soviet army broke the Nazi war machine in front of Moscow, but an ever-suspicious Stalin kept right on purging military commanders on charges of plotting against him.
In March 1941, President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act to provide aid for the Allies in their fight against Nazi Germany. His action sent convoys of American and British ships into the North Atlantic War Zone. The ships, loaded with arms and equipment, were attacked by continuous Nazi air assault. America's aid to one ally, Soviet Russia, was criticized by many. So Lend-Lease director Edward Stettinius went to the public to explain.
In the Soviet Union, most of the fighting has been done with Soviet equipment, but our aid has been important. In the past year, we and the British together shipped to the Soviet Union over the northern route alone more than 3,000 planes and 4,000 tanks.
Few countries ever repaid the $47 billion in Lend-Lease aid. The U.S. wrote off most of these debts, but not the Soviet obligation. Russia's $11 billion debt remained on the books. The eve of the Pearl Harbor raid of December 7th, 1941, Prime Minister Tojo and his cabinet have informed the Emperor that Japan will go to war against the United States. At dawn, the planes of Admiral Naguma's fleet took off to strike at America's foremost naval base in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. The American ambassador in Tokyo had cabled Washington, Japan may go all out in a do-or-die effort, even at the cost of committing national harakiri. Tojo went on the air to give the news of the Pearl Harbor raid. These Japanese propaganda films would seem to indicate that his announcement had a stunning impact. Representing a grief-stricken and angry nation, on December 8th, 1941, members of the United States Congress convened to declare war on Japan. The Pearl Harbor Holocaust had left the country little choice. When the Senate passed the resolution 82-0, it went to the House, where the calls of aye resounded, with one exception.
Aye, Pierce. Aye, Randolph. Aye, Rankin of Montana. Present. Votes present.
She had voted no to World War I. This time, Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana abstained, considering her abstention as a vote cast against all war.
Neither the length of the struggle nor any form of severity which it may assume will make us weary or will make us quit. On December 30th, 1941, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the Canadian Parliament of his efforts to persuade France not to surrender to Germany. When I warned them that Britain would fight on alone, whatever they did, their generals told their Prime Minister and his divided cabinet, in 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. Some neck. Hitler and his Nazi gang have sown the wind. Let them reap the whirlwind.
German submarines operating off our east coast sank 79 merchant ships in the 2 months following our declaration of war on Germany, December 11th, 1941. To portray the Nazi U-boat menace dramatically, newsreel companies combined captured German films with film footage released by our War Department. The first defensive measures were disorganized. Then the Navy assigned the Coast Guard to assist Air Force anti-submarine patrols. This system worked very well, and by May, our forces were keeping most of the U-boats out of East Coast waters. Although there were very few sure kills, wartime audiences thrilled to the sight of enemy panic and destruction in a doomed submarine. Increased patrol efficiency and the bombing of U-boat bases in Germany steadily freed the Atlantic supply line for its crucial role in the defeat of the Axis powers in Europe.
Four and a half days from keel to delivery. Henry J. Kaiser's revolutionary techniques of prefabrication and assembly led to the mass production of the so-called Liberty ships of World War II. No sooner was one finished than the cranes would swing over to lay the keel for the next one. Henry Kaiser himself showed on a model how the prefabricated sections were assembled at his Richmond, California yard. Brilliant as the operation was, it was not without mishaps. On October 4th, 1942, as the cranes lifted a completed superstructure onto the deck of the hull, the whole thing came crashing down. By 1945, American shipyards were turning out Liberty ships at a rate of better than one a day. Britain's General Bernard Montgomery, the careful, super-organized master tactician, was facing Germany's Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, whose brilliant improvisations had already earned him the name of the Desert Fox. At El Alamein, Rommel sent his tanks to attack in the south of Egypt's western desert, where Montgomery had led him to believe the British had massed the bulk of their forces. Allied planes blasted Rommel's tanks, which soon bogged down in the soft sand. The Desert Fox had fallen into the trap. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, Montgomery unleashed all the strength he had secretly built up in the north. The battle raged for days. At El Alamein, Montgomery committed his assault divisions en masse: Britons, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, and South Africans. They completely routed the combined German-Italian armies. It was Britain's first real victory against Hitler. Rommel's luster was considerably dimmed. As for Montgomery, from then on he was known as Montgomery of El Alamein. Colonel Jimmy Doolittle tells the dramatic story of that first surprise air raid on Tokyo, April 18th, 1942.
Each pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, gunner, and the ground crews were volunteers and were carefully trained for the specific mission.
Because we had no bases near enough to bomb Japan, the carrier Hornet served as a takeoff runway for Doolittle's B-25 Air Force bombers.
We approached the targets right on the treetops, pulled up to about 1,500 feet, and dropped our bomb. The damage done was terrific, both because of the low altitude and because of the highly inflammable nature of Japanese structures. The targets selected were all of a military nature. Among them was a cruiser. The salvo of bombs left it enveloped in flames.
Doolittle's men then flew on to China and were welcomed by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. Only 70 of the 82-man crew returned. But the daring raid raised American morale, and President Roosevelt promptly decorated Doolittle with the Congressional Medal of Honor. On May 6, 1942, Japanese forces conquered the last American outpost in the Philippines, Corregidor. They raised their flag after hauling down the Stars and Stripes. 3 years later, after countless battles on land, sea, and in the air, General Douglas MacArthur, at the head of liberating forces, recaptured the island fortress.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak. and let no enemy ever haul them down.
The date was March 2nd, 1945. Corregidor had spelled defeat in 1942. On this day, it spelled victory.
During World War II, captured Japanese films showing the surrender of Filipino and American soldiers on Bataan were shown to the American public. In movie houses across the country, people reacted with anger as they watched the ordeal and heard survivors describe the march of death.
We were marched a distance of approximately 140 miles, which lasted a period of 7 days. During this time, 40,000 Filipinos and approximately 7,000 Americans were butchered by the Japanese inhumane soldiers.
Another survivor voices his emotions.
For the sake of my little Jeannie and for the sake of your children, I hope that our terrible experiences have proven to you that there must never be a negotiated peace with these uncivilized barbarians.
There never was a negotiated peace. In August 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally.
In April and May 1942, General Joseph Stilwell, in command of the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies, was in full retreat from Burma. While headlines in the United States spoke of smashing victories against the Japanese, the truth was that the Allies were desperately trying to reach a safe haven in northern India. General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who had refused evacuation by air, personally led a contingent of Chinese, British, Australians, and Americans across wild rivers and forbidding jungles and mountain passes. When he finally reached India, Stilwell put it bluntly, "I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell."
The island of Midway, 1,000 miles northwest of Honolulu, becomes a target for Admiral Yamamoto's Japanese fleet. As with Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto plans a surprise assault that will spring an advance on Hawaii. But U.S. naval intelligence decodes Japanese messages. The Navy prepares for a showdown. The Japanese try to decoy American ships towards Alaska, but U.S. forces refuse the bait. U.S. planes knock out a dozen enemy vessels, and the prize, 4 aircraft carriers. The Battle of Midway ends with a Japanese retreat. This turns the tide for the once invincible Japanese Navy. The U.S. will continue to suffer casualties, but the tide is definitely turning in America's favor. Japan built a powerful fleet for World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy was determined to prevent an American counterattack by blocking Pacific Ocean invasion routes to the empire. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. fought 10 great sea and air battles against the Japanese Navy. 6 of those battles took place around the Solomons, a strategic chain of islands east of New Guinea and northeast of Australia. A decisive sea battle was fought when the Japanese tried to retake Guadalcanal. A combat report written by the Japanese at the time stated, "It must be said that success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal and the results of the final Navy battle related to it is the fork in the road which leads to victory for them or us." Japan lost the sea battle beginning November 13, 1942, and it never recovered from the blow. Guadalcanal, one of the Solomon Islands just east of New Guinea, sees Japan's first defeat on land in World War II. The Japanese military was constructing a mighty air base there with the aim of knocking out bases in Australia vital to the launching of a U.S. offensive in the South Pacific. The strategic importance of the island was evidenced by naval battles that had raged in its seas for 6 months. August 7, 1942, 10,000 U.S. Marines land on Guadalcanal and overwhelm the airbase. The enemy quickly re-infiltrates the island, fighting hellish jungle battles that leave 24,000 Japanese dead. The price of this first land victory over Japan, 1,800 American lives, and Tokyo still 3,000 miles away.
In June 1942, Hitler attacked Stalingrad with 23 divisions. It was to be the turning point of the German-Soviet conflict in World War II. Outnumbered at first, the Russians made the Germans pay heavily for every inch of the city. By November, the Soviets had encircled 250,000 Germans, but Hitler sent word, German soldiers must triumph or die. Instead, after appalling losses on February 2nd, 1943, they surrendered. German General von Paulus, whom Hitler had promoted to Field Marshal the day before, bitterly denounced his callousness and military stupidity. After learning that von Paulus had joined his troops in captivity, instead of committing suicide, Hitler was incensed. To think, he said, that I promoted him to Field Marshal. After Stalingrad, Hitler never recovered the initiative in his war against the Soviet Union. Responding to a demand from Stalin that the Allies open a second front in Europe, a contingent of Canadian and British commandos struck at the Nazi-held port of Dieppe on the French coast. It began and ended in one day, August 19th, 1942. This film is the British version of that raid, shown to audiences at home and abroad just after the event. Successful bombings by the R.A.F. were emphasized, and the only recognition of air losses was the rescue of a fighter pilot. A surprise came with the revelation that the first Americans to fight in Europe had taken part in the action. Although more than 2,000 men were captured and 1,000 killed, only returning wounded were shown. For this was wartime, and the living did much more for morale than images of the dead. The Nazis had held the French Channel port of Dieppe for 2 years, when suddenly on August 19, 1942, a British commando force with aerial cover attempted a landing. This film, shot by German cameramen for the German audience, accents a rapid response to the attack and demonstrates that a strong defensive system had been installed to keep a firm hold on occupied France. This first assault on Hitler's fortress Europe came as the Germans were attempting to encircle Moscow. What was meant here as a diversion turned into a disaster. From its toehold on the shore, a force of 5,000 Canadian and British troops was dislodged within a few hours. 1,000 killed, many wounded, and 2,000 captured. In true propaganda form, only enemy wounded and dead were shown. The Germans were winning this war, and the invisible price tag belonged to the future. From the time American bombing missions first took off from the embattled British Isles in 1941 to the end of World War II in Europe, the scope of their efforts was unprecedented in military history. Almost 250,000 heavy, medium, and light bombers crossed and recrossed the English Channel, fighting off Nazi interceptors and flying through curtains of anti-aircraft fire to bomb German targets. Using the famous Norden bomb site, they dropped 1.5 million tons of bombs on Berlin, Bremen, Hamburg, Cologne, Kiel, Frankfurt, and Dresden to cripple the Wehrmacht's nerve centers and sources of supply. 13,000 American airmen were wounded, and 81,000 died in this stupendous effort to end the war in Europe. For them, service stars in the windows back home and on hometown display boards were changed from blue to gold.
At the outbreak of World War II, Hermann Goering boasted that not an enemy bomb would fall on Berlin. But during the last 2 years of the war, more than 1,000 day and night bombings by British and American planes dropped nearly 170,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries on the city proper. The population fell by nearly 1 million. A third of the buildings had been destroyed or gutted by fire. Food was extremely scarce, and public transportation stopped completely in the last weeks. When the Soviets took the city in May 1945, they removed 85% of the remaining industrial equipment. 10 weeks later, the Allies entered a divided city that looked more like a graveyard. One of the few structures left untouched was the Olympic Stadium, where the black American track star Jesse Owens won 3 gold medals, but was snubbed by Adolf Hitler in 1936. Sporting the brand new 4-star insignia of a full general, only recently awarded him, Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower finally had victory in his grasp in North Africa. On May 7th, 1943, American, British, and French forces captured the Tunisian naval base of Bizerte. On May 13th, all Axis armies, some 275,000 men, surrendered to the Allies. The American performance in North Africa had been shaky at first. Untested troops had been bloodied in the initial battles, but final victory gave them self-confidence. The Allied triumph in North Africa, after 2 years of setbacks, was an important turning point in World War II. I always knew Hitler would give me this proof of friendship, said Benito Mussolini, as German paratroopers rescued him from captivity in a remote mountaintop hotel in central Italy. It was Sunday, September 12, 1943. After a hair-raising takeoff from a hastily cleared runway, Italy's fascist dictator, who had been deposed 7 weeks earlier, was flown to meet his benefactor, Adolf Hitler, at his headquarters on the Russian front. Hitler, who had always shown a certain deference to Mussolini, was later reported shaken by his friend's almost ghostly appearance. Il Duce was reunited with his son Vittorio. On September 19, 1943, he was formally restored to power thanks to his Nazi ally. But within 600 days, Mussolini would be executed by Italian partisans, and Hitler would die a suicide amid the flaming ruins of Berlin. The squadron leader told them, if we hit it good, we might cut 6 months off the war. Good luck. They would need it. The 175 B-24 bombers took off from Egypt on August 1st, 1943, to fly over the Mediterranean and the Balkans on a 2,400-mile round-trip mission to bomb Romania's oil fields at Ploesti, the most heavily defended target in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. A Romanian eyewitness marveled at the accuracy of the bombing, saying it was like a postman dropping a letter in the box. Hitler lost critical oil supplies just when he needed them most on the Italian and Russian front. The price was heavy. 53 planes, 310 American airmen killed. 1 of every 5 who reached the target. But the Ploesti oil fields was such an important target that the commanding general had said the mission would be a success, even if no one returned. January 22nd, 1944, U.S. and British troops landed at Anzio, a small town 33 miles south of Rome. The aim was to turn the flank of the Germans' Gustav Line, which barred the road to the Italian capital. Within days, 70,000 men and 18,000 vehicles had been put ashore. The Germans had been caught off guard, but soon their dive bombers started taking their toll of ships and troop concentrations on the beaches. Germany's Field Marshal Kesselring held the heights overlooking the Anzio beachhead and started pounding the Allies at will. For the American and British soldiers, it was concentrated hell, but they held on. In the end, it would take 4 months, 6 divisions, and heavy casualties to break out of Anzio. Correspondent Eric Severide would write as his opinion that the landing had been a stupid mistake. General Eisenhower and the Allied High Command knew they would come under heavy criticism. The massive air and artillery bombardment of Italy's ancient monastery at Monte Cassino on February 15, 1944, would be one of the most controversial decisions of the entire European campaign. A second bombardment came a month later. Ironically, the rubble provided the German defenders with even better positions. The fighting, often at close range, went on for weeks. When at heavy cost the Abbey was finally secured, Hitler's propagandists would broadcast that the Allies were barbarian desecrators of a great religious shrine, glossing over the fact that their own troops had turned Monte Cassino into a fortress. Its code name was Operation Overlord. The largest air attack in history paved the way for the men at sea who waited off the coast of Normandy. It was D-Day, June 6, 1944, the beginning of the end of Hitler's Europe. Within 48 hours, nearly 200,000 Allied soldiers had hit the beaches, and their Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, was able to tell the world,
"People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching.
They called him Blood and Guts Patton. To him, warfare was a series of lightning moves. He believed in the hero concept of war. Those who fought and died under Patton in World War II, in North Africa and Europe, either hated him or loved him. He asked a lot from his men. General George Patton was a flamboyant, unforgettable leader in battle.
God damn it, it's no fun to say to men that you love, go out and get killed. And we've had to say it. And by God, they have gone. And they have won. But I want you to remember that the sacrifice that these men have made must not be in vain.
Adolf Hitler at his headquarters in East Prussia, July 20th, 1944. The Fuhrer trying in vain to stem the tide of defeat. Many of his top-ranking generals plotting by now to do away with him. When the bomb planted close to him during one of the briefings exploded on July 20th, to the conspirators, it seemed that Hitler had finally been eliminated. The room was a shambles. But Hitler was alive. I had incredible luck, he said. The explosion had merely sprained his right elbow and ruined a new pair of trousers. He vowed vengeance.
Ihnen werden wir fertig, Firma. Die sind nicht berufen.
Hundreds of officers were put on trial, publicly humiliated, eventually put to death, often after lengthy torture. 9 months later, with the Russians a block away from his underground headquarters in Berlin, Hitler himself put a bullet through his head. To victorious Allied soldiers, the memory of one of the bloodiest tyrants in history was one of ridicule.
August 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower, architect of the European invasion, agreed that General Charles de Gaulle should lead a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. 2 days before, Free French forces had been handed the honor of retaking their capital city. Suddenly, gunfire from nearby buildings revealed the presence of French collaborators attempting to assassinate de Gaulle. The man who had returned France to its former glory waited calmly for the shooting to end. He was his country's national hero. The sight of the captured snipers in German uniforms infuriated loyal Parisians, and the traitors were quickly tried and executed. De Gaulle went on to become head of state twice in his lifetime. Revered by generations of Frenchmen, he was not a popular figure with many of his former allies.
The largest airborne assault of World War II began on September 17, 1944, with an Allied attempt to seize 5 bridges over the Rhine River and open a way into Nazi Germany. It was the 5th, the crucial bridge over the Lower Rhine, at a place called Arnhem, 64 miles behind German lines, that worried Allied commanders. The bridge had to be held long enough for British tanks to arrive. The airborne troops held on for 4 days. The tanks never reached the bridge. It was a bridge too far. The Allied operation that Field Marshal Montgomery hoped would quickly end the war had failed. Arnhem remained in Nazi hands until the end of the war.
Hitler called it the Vengeance Weapon, or V-2, a rocket-propelled improvement on the V-1. It had greater accuracy and speed, and a range of 210 miles, and a 1-ton warhead that could inflict great damage. It was first tested in 1942, not too successfully at first. In September 1944, the V-2 became operational. More than 5,000 were fired not only against England, but also Belgium and France, and at the end, even at some targets in Germany itself. In the midst of his final defeat, it was Hitler's last act of terror, claiming thousands of civilian casualties. The landing at the island of Morotai off New Guinea was the last preliminary operation before the long-awaited assault on the Philippines. It was September 15, 1944, and while Japanese resistance was light, the soft landing beaches got everybody bogged down. As it turned out, Morotai could have been bypassed, since at about this time, U.S. intelligence had determined that Japanese air power in the Philippines was not as strong as at first believed, and direct assault was feasible. But General Douglas MacArthur was already committed to Morotai as a vital target in his campaign. In any case, MacArthur's historic "I have returned" landing at Leyte in the Philippines 5 weeks later would be far more glamorous and sure-footed. In October 1944, hundreds of Japanese pilots, realizing their country was losing the war, determined to hurl themselves against U.S. Navy ships to destroy them. It was meant to be an act of supreme sacrifice, calling themselves Kamikaze, or Divine Wind, after the legendary typhoon that drove back foreign invaders in ancient times. They went off to certain death with a supreme sense of fatalism. Kamikaze attacks involved as many as 1,500 planes at a time, but most of them were blasted out of the sky before they could reach the ships. For the Japanese, the kamikaze did not prove to be the ultimate weapon that could defeat the American invasion. 1942, the Japanese completed their conquest of the Philippines. Corregidor had finally surrendered. In Australia, General MacArthur made an historic pledge.
I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
The road back to Corregidor in the Philippines would take 2.5 years. General Douglas MacArthur led American forces in a series of air assaults and amphibious operations that drove the Japanese from the strategic islands they had occupied. MacArthur acquired a reputation as a man who knew the value of the memorable phrase and the dramatic gesture. With the beaches still under Japanese fire, on October 20th, 1944, in one of the most publicized pictures of World War II, he stepped ashore in the Philippines, redeeming his historic pledge. Adolf Hitler himself had come to the launching of the 42,500-ton battleship, the Tirpitz. With her sister ship, the Bismarck, she was the pride of his navy. But historians agree that while a reckless gambler on land, Hitler was a coward at sea. During World War II, he would station the Tirpitz in Norwegian waters as a potential threat to Allied convoys headed for Russia. In many raids, Britain's Royal Air Force tried to destroy the Tirpitz. Badly damaged several times, she was repaired at great cost, which Hitler resented. She was attacked once again by 29 British Lancaster bombers on November 22nd, 1944, while anchored in Norway's Tromsø Fjord. Mortally wounded this time, the great battle wagon sank, with a loss of 1,400 officers and seamen. The Germans unexpectedly counterattacked on the Western Front in mid-December 1944. By the 22nd, they had the Belgian town of Bastogne completely encircled and called on the American defenders to surrender, to which General Anthony McAuliffe replied with one word, nuts, which had to be explained to the Germans as meaning, go to hell. The siege continued. Eventually, key units of General Patton's Third Army were sent to the rescue of beleaguered Bastogne. They met heavy German resistance. When the first units reached the outskirts of Bastogne on December 26th, they were greeted by McAuliffe with, I am mighty glad to see you. The weather had finally cleared, and Bastogne could be supplied from the air, while bomber and fighter planes pounded the enemy. Patton had sent his troops to the rescue of Bastogne with a special prayer for good weather, composed by a chaplain, whom he later decorated with a Bronze Star. McAuliffe's men became known as the Battling Bastards of Bastogne. McAuliffe's reply of nuts to the Germans has been written in the history books. He was decorated by General Patton. Why had he put it so bluntly to the Germans? McAuliffe, a man of few words, replied, their demand was absurd.
Nazi forces create a large bulge in the Allied front in Belgium's Ardennes forest, with a blistering surprise counterattack beginning at 5 a.m. on December 16, 1944. Adolf Hitler personally masterminds the attack against the advice of his generals in the hope of splitting the Allied ground forces facing Germany's western border. Though Nazi panzer divisions and infantry make stunning progress in the first 3 days of the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies soon tighten. General Montgomery's forces squeeze in from the north and General Bradley's from the south. A month later, the Germans withdraw, with Hitler losing his gamble and 120,000 men. The days remaining for the Third Reich are clearly numbered and counting down.
February 19th, 1945. In the Pacific, an aerial bombardment spearheaded the attack by United States fighting men on an island known until then by few, if any, Americans. naval ships joined in the combined sea and air operation that provided the support for an assault force of more than 75,000 Marines needed to secure a perilous beachhead. The bloody fighting against the fanatical Japanese defenders went on for 26 days and was among the most bitter and costly of the Pacific War. 5,000 Marines died to capture the 8 square miles of the tiny volcanic island and to raise Old Glory atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. When in February 1945, President Roosevelt attended the Yalta Conference with Britain's Prime Minister Churchill and Russia's Marshal Stalin, he was clearly in poor health. When a month later, he reported to the Congress, he made an unusual reference to his handicap.
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say. I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs, and also because of the fact that I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip.
President Roosevelt had been crippled by polio in 1921, but that did not prevent him from serving 12 years as a remarkable chief executive. Manila, capital of the Philippines. Early in 1945, 3 years and 6 weeks after they had evacuated the city in defeat, the Americans were back in Manila, but the Japanese defenders put up a stubborn defense, house by house, street by street, for several weeks. The diary of a Japanese soldier read, "There is no hope. How will the Japanese homeland ever face this victorious enemy?" And one GI wrote, "I never thought it would be like this. We got to give our guts for every inch we get. I wish it were over with one way or another." American casualties on the Philippines' main island of Luzon, where Manila was the prize, included 8,000 killed. General Douglas MacArthur entered Manila and greeted American civilians liberated from Japanese prisons. The end of an ordeal. Final victory over Japan was in sight, but still 6 months away. On March 9th, 1945, Allied forces, British, Indian, Australian, Chinese, landed in strength to recapture Mandalay, Rangoon, and all of Burma from the Japanese who had conquered it 3 years earlier. The war in Europe was just about over, and the Allies were now ready to deal the final blows on Japan. Britain expected to reabsorb Burma in its Far East Empire. Though most Burmese welcomed their liberation from the Japanese, for the majority of them, Britain's earlier defeat at the hands of an Asian power spelled the end of British prestige and dominion. Burma would become an independent nation on January 4th, 1948, and would increasingly isolate itself from the West. Jammed with planes ready to take off, loaded with high-octane gasoline, bombs, and rockets, the U.S. carrier Franklin had been hit by a Japanese dive bomber. It was March 19th, 1945. The Franklin was rocked by a series of explosions. 832 crewmen lay dead. 270 were wounded. After several hours, she was listing badly. Accompanying destroyers started to pick up part of the Franklin's surviving crew. It seemed that the Franklin was doomed, but the heroic efforts of her firefighting crew, using new techniques learned from the New York City Fire Department, had saved the ship. Several months later, battered and damaged, with gaping holes, but under her own power, the USS Franklin came home, past the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. On March 5th, 1945, Allied troops captured Cologne. Then miraculously at Regagen, they found the railway bridge across the Rhine still intact. On March 7th, the 9th Armored Division took it before German demolition teams had a chance to blow it up. Allied troops would cross the Rhine without getting their feet wet. Hitler was furious and sent his few remaining planes to destroy the bridge. Under their near misses, the already weakened span collapsed, hurling some G.I.s into the icy waters, from which they were eventually rescued. Alongside the Regagen Bridge, or what was left of it, a pontoon bridge was soon in place. When General Hodges had first told him of his success, General Omar Bradley had said, "Hot dog, Courtney, shove everything you can across it. Button the bridgehead up tightly." The First Army did just that. On April 16, 1945, Soviet forces launched their final assault on Berlin, capital of Nazi Germany. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the Russians were within artillery range of the city. Hitler could hear the explosions of their shells in his underground headquarters. Soviet soldiers fought their way ever closer to Hitler's headquarters, flushing German defenders out of rubble and sewers. But Hitler himself escaped the victorious armies by committing suicide, saying, "I have to admit, Germany is beaten." In Moscow, as in all other Allied capitals, wild rejoicing greeted Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was officially over at midnight, May 8, 1945. Driving into the heart of Germany from the east, Soviet forces were in headlong pursuit of Hitler's retreating armies. It was April 1945. In the west, U.S. forces with their British, Canadian, and French allies had overcome all German resistance and were on their way to link up with the advancing Russians in the middle of Germany. The historic meeting took place on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 25th of April, at Torgau on the River Elbe, 75 miles south of Berlin. "This is the happiest day of our lives," said one Russian major. "We meet one another, and this is the end of our enemy." Russians and Americans traded war experiences, spoke of families and home, exchanged all sorts of souvenirs, and celebrated their friendship for several days. The goodwill was soon to turn into confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The meeting at the Elbe was the high point of a wartime alliance, which could not submerge clashing interests and ideologies.
Italy's Benito Mussolini had been the idol of millions since 1922. On June 10, 1940, he declared war on France and England, and the Italians cheered. 5 years later, with his mistress, he lay dead on the pavement of a gas station in Milan, executed by Italian partisans while trying to flee disguised as a German airman. In his glory days, he had quoted an ancient Roman folk hero, "If I advance, follow me. If I retreat, kill me." On April 28, 1945, they killed him, and the spectacle of a mob's revenge on his body was one of the more gruesome spectacles of the end of World War II. May 1945. Nazi Germany was in its death agony. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. The Third Reich was in flames. Russian troops had overrun Berlin, while Allied forces, by prior agreement, waited on the city's outskirts. German resistance was crumbling in the face of the relentless assault by the advancing Allies. May 7th, 2:30 a.m.
Gustav Jodl, German chief of staff, arrived at a little red schoolhouse in Reims, France, to surrender unconditionally to the Allies. The war in Europe was over after 5 years, 8 months, and 6 days. Its toll, 15 million lives, almost $1 trillion. Rising to leave, Jodl asked the victors to treat Germany with generosity. There was no reply. So ended Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. On August 4th, 1945, American planes showered Hiroshima with the obscure message, "Your city will be obliterated unless your government surrenders." 2 days later, by order of President Truman, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It was nicknamed Little Boy. 100,000 people died within an hour.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
3 days later, a second atomic strike fell on Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered. After the firebombings of Tokyo, the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito decided that Japan must surrender. It was the middle of August 1945. Despite the devastation and the hopelessness of Japan's position, die-hard militarists wanted to continue the war. But the Emperor, for once, made an independent decision. He would deliver an unusual broadcast to the nation. Unusual in that the Japanese had actually never heard his voice. Unusual also in that he spoke a kind of ancient court language the average Japanese could not understand. But somehow they understood. Japan had lost the war and must surrender. Word of the Japanese surrender in World War II came through Switzerland. Then on September 2nd, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur directed the signing of the surrender agreement on board the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. His sense of history overcame any baser feelings he may have held as a soldier.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Lying immediately behind the signing by the Japanese was a deep crisis at the Imperial Palace. The military leaders preferring even death to seeing their emperor subjugated by a foreign power. Hirohito himself made the final decision to bow to the will of the Allies.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always.
Several times during the 11 months of war crimes trials at Nuremberg, Germany, Nazi Air Marshal Hermann Goering found something to laugh about. But his mood changed every time the courtroom was darkened to show films of atrocities committed by the Nazis. Lord Justice Lawrence did the final summing up for the prosecution.
12 million men, women, and children have died murdered in cold blood. Millions upon millions more today mourn their fathers and their mothers, their husbands, their wives, and their children. What rights has any man to mercy who has played a part, however indirectly, in such a crime?
On October 1st, 1946, the creator of the concentration camps, Hermann Goering, was sentenced to death, but committed suicide. 11 were executed, 3 acquitted. The rest went to prison.
Dispositions have been taken to eliminate for all time the authority and influence of those who misled the people of Japan into embarking on world conquest, and to establish in Japan a new order of peace, security, and justice.
So spoke General Douglas MacArthur. On November 12, 1948, Premier Tojo and 23 other Japanese leaders heard their sentences after a 2-year trial had produced evidence of their participation in war crimes.
Accused Shimada Shigetaro, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to imprisonment for life. Accused Togo Shigenori, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to imprisonment for 20 years as from the date of arraignment.
Now the number 1 man.
Accused Tojo Hideki, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to death by hanging.
Along with Heinrich Himmler and Air Marshal Hermann Goering, other Nazis close to Adolf Hitler included men like Joseph Goebbels and many lesser-known but important figures. One of these was Adolf Eichmann, a Gestapo chief who was handed the task of devising a final solution for the Jewish problem. Although Goering created the infamous concentration camps, it was Eichmann who promoted the use of gas chambers for extermination. Eichmann escaped the war crimes trial in Nuremberg by fleeing to the Middle East in 1945. Then he made his way to Argentina, hiding out for 10 years until tracked down and captured in this remote farmhouse by agents of the Israeli Secret Service. In Jerusalem, Tuvia Friedman, a civilian known as the Nazi Hunter, received a major share of the credit for locating Eichmann, who was convicted of crimes against humanity and executed by hanging on May 31st, 1962. 6 million human beings had died on his orders. Of all the death factories that the Nazis put up in Eastern Europe, none was worse than Auschwitz in southern Poland. In April 1967, the camp was dedicated as a permanent memorial to the 4 million prisoners who perished here. Children, women, and men, they were starved, beaten, humiliated, shot, gassed, and their 4 million bodies burned in the furnaces of Auschwitz. A monument now stands where their cries were heard, where the acrid stench of burning bodies filled the air. At Auschwitz, where pathetic notes were found imploring the survivors to bear witness that it happened here at Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945. 4 million people brought here by the deportation trains to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. In the mid-1950s, President Dwight Eisenhower recorded this lasting tribute to the symbolic hero of World War II.
All agree in the selection of the one truly heroic figure in that war.
He is G.I. Joe, and his counterpart in the air, the Navy, and the Merchant Marine. He has braved the dangers of U-boat-infested seas. He has surmounted charges on desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon leader have given us an example of loyalty and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.